during the 1950s and 1960s. Plessy versus Ferguson, that insidious 1896 Supreme Court decision allowing states to pass segregation laws under the guidelines of allowing states to say that it was separate but equal. Separate but equal. Think about it, separate but equal. That was the law of the land until 1954, when Thurgood Marshall successfully argued Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. I attended school before the Brown decision, and I can assure you, our schools were definitely separate, and they were definitely not equal. Anytime books that you used in your schools in a separate black school, all the books had to be used by all the white students, and they were brought to us, many of them with pages missing, scribbled, and so forth. But those are the books that had to be used by our teachers to try to teach us. And also, they were not allowed to teach us any science at all. No science. I've never seen a chemistry book until I went to college. I'd never seen a math book, not algebra or any of those sciences, geometry, nothing, until I went to college. Wow. That's what they meant by separate but equal. Well, it was fully 10 years later that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave all Americans the right to serve in facilities or to be in facilities which were open to the public. And that was the hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments, as well as greater protection for the right of vote. Malcolm X died in February 1965. Now turn this around, and you'll realize that almost all of his entire life, Mr. Malcolm lived in America, where African Americans were not afforded equal protection under the law, and where segregation, prejudice, and hateful ways were of the way of life. In effect, he lived in a very different America from what we know now. I don't believe I could have been friends with the young Malcolm Little, soon to be Malcolm X. As a young woman growing up in the South, I could easily understand his anger and his hatred. Everywhere he looked, he saw evidence and the Jim Crow laws that made his family, his friends, and every black American he knew second-class citizens whose lives were circumscribed by fear and despair. His father and uncle were killed by white supremacists, and he watched his mother being taken to a mental hospital when he was 13, leading to his life in a series of foster homes. Sadly, the path taken by this young man would have been of no surprise to me. During an early imprisonment, he felt certain that his life was over, that there was little hope for his survival in a hostile world. In late 1948, he wrote a letter to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam. The Honorable Muhammad advised him to atone for his crimes by renouncing his past and by humbly vowing in prayer to Allah and promising never to engage in destructive behavior again. Malcolm, who always had been rebellious and deeply skeptical, found it very difficult to bow in prayer. It took him a week to bend his knees. Finally, he prayed, and he became a member of the Nation of Islam. For the remainder of his incarceration, Malcolm maintained regular correspondence with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. On August 7, 1952, Malcolm was paroled and released from prison. He later reflected on the time he spent in prison after his conversion. Between the Honorable Elijah's teaching, my correspondence, my visitors, and my reading books, months passed without ever thinking about being in prison. In fact, up to then, I had never been so truly free in my life. As a religious person myself, I understand the power of faith Malcolm experienced in prison and the way he was able to harness his life. It is understandable that the man who helped him survive the horrors of prison would have great sway over Malcolm's life, but I am certain we would have parted during this period. However, I ask you in the audience who are old enough to do so to consider the difference between what you were like when you were angry, an angry man or angry woman, when you were sure you knew how to right all the world's wrongs, and the way you are now. If you can recognize the difference in yourself, will surely understand the transformation of Malcolm X as he was about to mature into one of the greatest leaders of the era. Malcolm continued his Muslim faith, but he began to separate from the Nation of Islam and its leader, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He understood that separatism espoused by his former mentor would not lead to his goals for African Americans, and we'd have to find another path. In his famous "The Ballot or the Bullet" speech of April 1964, he defined his goals for Black Americans in the clearest of terms. He said, "I'm not going to sit at your table and watch you eat with nothing on my plate and call myself a diner. Sitting at the table doesn't make you a diner unless you eat some of what's on that plate. Being here in America doesn't make you an American. Being born here in America doesn't make you an American. But why, if born made you an American, you wouldn't need any legislation. You wouldn't need any amendments to the Constitution." Later in the same speech, he said, "If it doesn't take senators and congressmen and presidential proclamations to give freedom to the white man, it is not necessary for legislation or proclamations, a Supreme Court decision to give freedom to the Black man. You let that white man know, if this is a country of freedom, let it be a country of freedom. And if it is not a country of freedom, change it." When asked about his religion by reporters attempting to bait him, he replied, "Islam is my religion, but I believe my religion is my personal business. It governs my personal life, my personal morals, and my religious philosophy is personal between me and the God in whom I believe." This mature Malcolm, the man who found his voice and used it to defend his people and his religious belief, is someone I could respect and work with. Sadly, the country lost him shortly after this transformation, and we will never know what he might have accomplished had he not been assassinated. I thank you for this opportunity, and I certainly want to thank this wonderful center for what you do. Many people may not know that you grow vegetables each year to supply the needs of the hunger at the center in Hempstead. It is a wonderful thing that you do. That's just one of the various good deeds that you do.